I am 81 years old, and I have not much time left on this earth. My doctors have made that clear. My heart is failing in the way hearts do when they carry too much weight for too long. I have decided to tell you the truth before I die. The truth about faith, about certainty, about the cost of believing you are righteous. I have spent 53 years as a cantor in Borough Park, Brooklyn. I have led prayers that moved men to tears. I have sung the Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur until the sanctuary shook with repentance. I have been respected. I have been feared. I have been absolutely certain that I understood God's will. I am here to tell you that certainty can be a prison, that righteousness can be a blade, and that sometimes the person we wounded in God's name was the only one who could have saved us. My father arrived in Brooklyn in 1948 with nothing. He wore the same clothes for 3 years. He had a number on his arm from Auschwitz. He never spoke about what happened there. He simply rebuilt. He married my mother. He opened a small fabric shop on 13th Avenue. And he prayed every morning before dawn, every evening after sunset, every Shabbat, every holiday. He prayed with a kind of fury that was defiance. Prayer was his way of telling Hitler that he had failed, that the Nazis had not destroyed the Jewish people, that faith would resurrect what malice tried to murder. I was born in 1945. I grew up watching my father's devotion like a child watches a lighthouse. His certainty was absolute. There were rules about everything. No work on Shabbat, no secular books, no friendships with Christians, no radio, no television. My mother lived according to these laws with quiet obedience that I now see was suffering. She wanted to speak to her sister in Manhattan, who had married a Gentile. My father said this was spiritual death. They did not speak for 23 years. My mother cried in the kitchen when she thought no one could hear. But I understood it as righteousness. I loved my father. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to carry on his defiance. So I became a cantor. I studied the liturgy for 7 years. I learned to sing in the traditional nusach. My voice was strong. It could reach the back of the sanctuary. When I sang Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur, the men wept. Women covered their faces. Something ancient and broken moved through the room. It was the closest I came to understanding God's presence. I married Ruth in 1967. She was from a good family. Her father was a rabbi. We had 4 children. We lived strictly. We kept Shabbat with absolute precision. My house became known as the strictest in Borough Park. When my children wanted to watch television, I said no. When they wanted friends who were not Jewish, I said no. I believed I was protecting them. I believed I was preserving something sacred. I believed that every rule I enforced was a barrier between my children and spiritual death. For 31 years, this was my life. I was the cantor. I was the model of observance. The rabbis respected me. The community looked to me as an example of how a Jew should live. I was proud. I was very proud. I led services. I sang at bar mitzvahs and funerals. I was present at the most sacred moments of people's lives. I carried their faith in my voice. I felt chosen. I felt that I had inherited my father's defiance and was doing sacred work. This is what pride does. It closes your eyes. It makes you believe that what you cannot see is not there. It makes you certain that the darkness you will not look at does not exist. In 1997, I was 51 years old. I had been cantor for 18 years. The head rabbi of Borough Park came to me. His name was Rabbi Mendel Steinman. He was revered. He had been prominent in the community for 40 years. He came to me after services and asked me to follow him to his study. I remember the afternoon light through the window. I remember feeling honored. I thought perhaps he wanted to congratulate me. I was foolish. He told me something that made the floor shift beneath me. He told me that he had been taking money from the Holocaust Survivors Fund. He had been stealing from elderly men and women who had suffered in the camps. The money was supposed to help them with medical bills, with rent, with basic survival. He had taken it. He told me this without shame. He said the money was being used for important community purposes. He said that the survivors had already suffered enough, and that it was better for them to suffer a little more financially than for the community to suffer spiritually through lack of funds. This was his justification. This was how he explained thievery. He also told me about the other things he had done. He had manipulated elderly survivors. He had convinced them that their memories of the camps were confused. He had used their vulnerability to increase his own authority. He had isolated them from their families. I listened to this confession and felt the world I had built begin to crack. He said he was telling me because he wanted me to understand the weight of leadership. He said that sometimes a leader must make difficult choices. He said that if I were to become head rabbi someday, I would need to accept this burden. Then he told me that I must say nothing. He said that the community could not survive this revelation. He said that if this became public, the entire structure of faith would collapse. He said that my silence was necessary. He said it was holy. I agreed, and for 22 years I said nothing. I was the man who sang Kol Nidre while the person leading the service had stolen from survivors. I was the man who looked into the faces of these elderly people and smiled while knowing what had been taken from them. I was the man who enforced absolute righteousness at home while protecting absolute corruption in the institution I served. This is what the refusal to see does. It makes you complicit. It makes you a partner in the darkness. During these years, I began to read Isaiah alone at night, not for study or prayer, but because something in me was breaking. I would read chapter 53, Isaiah 53, the chapter about the suffering servant, someone who would be despised and rejected and wounded for the transgressions of others. The chapter that every rabbi told me referred to the Jewish people collectively, to the nation suffering for redemption. But as I read it in the darkness of my study, with the weight of knowledge about Rabbi Steinman, I could not explain it away using the interpretations I had been given. The words were too specific. The description was too individual. Someone was suffering for someone else's sins. Someone was being pierced for the transgressions of his people. Someone was being cut off from the living for the rebellion of my people. It did not sound like a nation. It sounded like a person. It sounded like a single, specific person who had accepted the punishment that belonged to others. I tried to reconcile this with what I had been taught, but the words would not fit. The more I read them, the more they seemed to point toward something I had not been allowed to consider. I began to read other prophets. I read Zechariah. I read Psalm 22. These texts kept describing something specific and redemptive. They kept describing a person being pierced, being rejected. Every night I would read, and every night I would feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. And somewhere in that darkness, there was a truth I did not have permission to speak. In 2009, my son Daniel came home from Columbia University and told me he had become a believer in Yeshua. He said it the way he had learned to say it in Hebrew, as if reclaiming something. He told me he had studied the messianic prophecies in Isaiah and believed they pointed to one person. He believed that Jesus was the Messiah. He said this in our living room on a Friday evening before Shabbat. He said it quietly and with certainty that I recognized because it was the same certainty I had carried my whole life. I felt something tear inside me. I felt a rage that came from somewhere deeper than my mind. I felt abandoned. I felt betrayed. I felt that my son had chosen to destroy everything I had built, every rule I had enforced, every friendship I had forbidden him to have, every secular pleasure I had denied him. And it had all been for nothing because he believed in Jesus. I walked to the bedroom where Ruth was resting and came back with a photograph of Daniel's bar mitzvah. It was from 19 years earlier. He was 13 years old, standing at the bimah in his talit, singing Haftarah, with a voice that broke because he was nervous but strong. It was the photograph that meant the most to me. It showed everything I had tried to teach him. I tore it to pieces in front of him. I tore it in front of community elders who were in my house that evening. I looked my son in the face and said that he was dead to me. I said that I had failed as a father. I said that he had chosen spiritual death. Then I left the room. Daniel left that night. He did not come back for 12 years. The house became quieter. Ruth began to decline into dementia during those years. She would sit at the Shabbat table and sometimes ask, "Where is Daniel? Where is our son?" And I would tell her that Daniel was not part of our family anymore, that he had made a choice, that we must not speak of him. But I could see the pain in her eyes. I could see her trying to remember why her son was gone. Ruth died in 2015. She died without ever holding Daniel again. She died with his name being a wound that I would not allow to heal. For years after her death, I sat alone in that apartment in Borough Park. The Shabbat table was silent. The Friday evenings that had been sacred became torture. I would light the candles. I would make the blessings. I would sit in gathering darkness and wait for the sun to set. And somewhere in that darkness, I began to understand what I had done. I had torn my son from the family in the name of righteousness. I had told him he was dead because he had learned to read a text differently than I had been taught. I had become the thing I hated most. I had silenced truth the way the rabbis had silenced the cries of the survivors. In 2016, Ruth had been dead for 1 year, and I was 79 years old in a hospital waiting room in Mount Sinai. The doctor said my heart was failing. I was waiting for results that would determine whether I could survive surgery. I was sitting there at night alone, and there was a New Testament on the seat beside me. Someone had left it there. It was worn. The pages were soft from being held. And when I looked at it, I saw that Isaiah 53 was underlined. Someone had been reading this. Someone had been wrestling with the same text that had haunted me for 22 years. I picked it up. I began to read. I read the underlined passages in Isaiah. Then I looked at what came next. Matthew 27, the account of the trial and execution of Jesus. Someone had connected the prophecy to the fulfillment. The piercing, the division of garments, the darkness at noon, the cry of dereliction, the pouring out of the soul unto death. Everything was there. Everything was connected. And I sat in that waiting room and I wept. I wept for 22 years of refusing to see. I wept for my son. I wept for my wife, who had died not knowing that truth was possible. I did not return to my apartment that night. I went directly to Philadelphia. I found Daniel. I had kept his telephone number hidden in my prayer book for 12 years. I called him and he answered on the first ring. He said, "Abba," and I said, "Danny, I am coming to you. I will be there in the morning. I need you to help me understand." We spoke for 3 hours that night. We wept together. Daniel told me about his faith. He told me about studying the prophecies. He told me about finding Jesus in the Old Testament. He told me that he had never stopped loving me, that every day for 12 years he had prayed for me. In the morning, I went to the church where Daniel was a pastor. I stood before the congregation. I told them my name. I told them I was the man who had torn his son from his family. I told them I had spent 12 years learning the cost of pride and certainty. I told them I believed that Jesus was the Messiah, that the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 was Jesus, that he had been pierced for my transgressions. And I asked them to baptize me. They baptized me in water that was cold and shocking, and I felt the weight of 79 years come off. I felt the ice that had formed around my heart for my entire life begin to thaw. I reconciled with my son. I held the torn photograph of his bar mitzvah. I had taped it back together. The pieces did not fit perfectly, but I kept it. It showed not perfection, but redemption. I asked Daniel's forgiveness. He embraced me. He said, "I forgive you, Abba. I have forgiven you for years. I have been waiting for you. I am telling you this because you must know. You must know that what you have been taught about Isaiah 53 might not be true. You must know that the interpretations you have been given might be wrong. You must read this chapter yourself. You must read it alone, without the commentary, without the interpretations from the men you have been taught to trust. You must let it speak to you. You must be brave enough to let it say what it says. Because if it points to Jesus, that is what it will say. And if you are brave enough to follow that truth, you will lose everything I lost. Your community, your certainty, your pride, your family. But you will also find everything I found. You will find redemption. You will find that the person you were taught to reject is the only one who can save you. I am 81 years old. My heart is failing. My time is almost finished. I am telling you this truth while I still can, because someone once read Isaiah 53 to me in a hospital waiting room, and that act of grace changed everything. You deserve that same grace. You deserve to know that there is a Messiah, and his name is Jesus, and he loves you more than I ever did. He will never cast you out.